strikes me as this series comes to an end is the fantastic unity between the first chapter of John and the last chapter, which we consider in this message. Most commentators explain incarnation, that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, on the basis of John chapter 1. As explained earlier, the concept of incarnation came to us from the Latin language and is very abstract and rational in nature. I have found it to be a very difficult, if not impossible, concept to translate and communicate in African languages. Having adapted myself to the African love of the concrete and relational, however, I shifted my explanations from incarnation to the life-in-life perspective that you have heard throughout this series. Is my effort necessary? Some may think not, especially if their vocabulary already includes incarnation. The truth is that there is no more important concept to struggle with in our gospel understanding and presentation. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, as declared by John in chapter 1, deserves our best effort. So I hope my life-in-life perspective has shown you a way to see this truth in a clearer light. In the first place, the perspective offers a way to recognize God's divine life in the human life of Jesus in his every conversation, his every event, activity, miracle, sign, parable, instruction, and encounter, not just the first chapter of John. The concept can be traced throughout the entire gospel. It will now clarify many things in John chapter 21. The life-in-life gospel describes Jesus, but it also describes what Jesus seeks in every believer. Incarnation, as some people call it. So the Gospel of John ends not with John 20 to just believe the gospel, but with the challenge of John 21 to go out and live the gospel. Just as life-in-life has opened up our eyes to God's revelation in every chapter of John, it does so again in this last chapter. The previous message for John 20 circled around the theme of belief. Up to the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, the disciples had not yet arrived at a life-changing understanding of Christ's life-in-life ways and ministry. They were still attached too much to small life thinking based on their previous worldviews, religion, and cultural experiences. The Lord's appearances were designed to call their attention to their precarious belief and move them on to a gospel belief based on revelation and clearly focused on the power of the life-in-life gospel in daily living. This message will circle around the theme of living out the life-in-life gospel. The disciples needed to realize that this gospel was not just something to believe, but it was something to believe and live. This gospel was something that was going to forever change their behaviors, not just their beliefs. Their belief had changed when they saw the resurrected Lord in different ways. Because of that belief, Jesus breathed on them and they received the gift of life. But we ask, did they reveal changed living? Chapter 21 answers that question. We know Jesus appeared to the disciples on the evening of his resurrection, and he appeared a second time to them a week later. We don't know how much later it was that he appeared to them in Galilee. We know it was long enough for the 7 disciples mentioned in this chapter to walk from Jerusalem. They probably didn't just walk. They probably ran. They fled the city, getting away from the traumatic events of the crucifixion. Galilee and fishing was the center of their lives. So who led them on that flight? It was Peter. And this message about the necessity of not only believing the gospel, but also living the gospel is very much about him. And it's about us. After seeing Jesus, being reminded of his promises kept, hearing his declaration of their heavenly peace, and even after receiving divine life in the name of Jesus, Peter said, "I'm going fishing." His changed belief in Jerusalem had affected his head, but not his heart, his hands, and his feet. he was still a man of action, more heart, hands, and feet than head. Sitting around in Jerusalem thinking about what all this meant was not his passion. Such inactivity was intolerable to him. So he said, I'm going fishing. The 6 other disciples, including John, said, we will go with you. None of them were inspired either. They had no desire to do something with what they believed, whether they were the thinking types, the social types, or the steady types. Jesus was absent, and they needed a leader. They followed Peter. Where? Back to his boat on the Sea of Galilee. The Lord had sent them, and they went. They went fishing. They ignored the divine life they had been given, and again pursued human life interests. The result, according to verse 3, they fished all night, but caught nothing. As the new day dawned, they saw a stranger on the shore, who asked if their life-centered choice of activity had resulted in any success. It had not. The Lord's presence was the beginning of lessons the disciples needed to learn about living the gospel. Fishing was the wrong activity. It was not what he had sent them to do. Failure was the right result, because their new gift of divine life in their life had been ignored. And to make his point, Jesus told them to put their nets on the right side of the boat for success. They did so, and immediately had their nets full and heavy. It was John, the one who had learned to look more carefully and wisely when he peered into the empty tomb, who recognized the miracle and the stranger. He said, it's the Lord, he who is sovereign over fish, all creation, and them. It was Peter, ever the action-oriented, impulsive, spontaneous disciple, who jumped into the water and swam toward Jesus. This encounter with the Lord at this lake was very much like the Lord's appearance to them all once before, the first time, when the result had also been a miraculous catch of fish, according to Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. The disciples followed Peter in their boat. Arriving at the shore, they learned another lesson about living the gospel, not just believing it. Jesus is part of that living, and he comes with all his resources. Here, they simply found him having fish and bread already prepared on a charcoal fire. Jesus even told them to bring their fish. Before others could act again, Peter jumped back into the boat and brought the whole net full. There were 153 large fish. Jesus was there with his life-in-life resources. They were still there with their small life resources. But notice that they counted the fish, just like men. Jesus wanted them to count the results of gospel living. Jesus invited them to eat with him, a lesson for gospel living that demonstrated that being sent and having God's life within operated in the common daily activities of work, skills, provisions, needs, preparations, and routine daily activities. Jesus demonstrated that the life-in-life intentions of God included men just like them, some who failed, like Peter, others who doubted, like Thomas, some hot-tempered and ambitious, like John and James, and even nameless others, all of whom would be challenged to life-in-life gospel living beyond their human personalities. The disciples sat in stunned silence. Why? Within the past several days, and before they fled from Jerusalem, they had received Mary Magdalene's first-hand witness. Peter and John had seen the empty tomb on their own. 10 of them had seen Jesus appear in their secret room. The Lord had breathed life into their lives, and they had seen the Lord bring Thomas to a new life-changing belief. Maybe they were silent because they were ashamed. They knew the Lord, as clarified in verse 12, but they also knew themselves as they sat at that meal. Who were they? They were still the small life people they had always been. After eating, Jesus spoke to Peter and probably got his interest by calling him by the name with which he had originally come to Jesus at this very same lake. That name was Simon, John chapter 1. Had Peter returned to being Simon only? an ordinary man caught up in shame like the other disciples? Was his identity only about human life with no reference to divine life? Had Peter failed to live up to the name given him by the Lord, Peter the Rock? Was he just Simon again? Jesus asked Simon, "Simon, do you love me more than these?" Maybe he was referring to the 153 fish in the net. Maybe to the other disciples. 3 times Simon answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Notice that he did not say, "more than these." Jesus responded by calling Simon's attention to the activities of a shepherd and his sheep. Fishing and large fish were no longer the subject matter for what was to become Peter's gospel living. Once again, we miss the significance of this dialogue when we fail to consider the Greek words. The word for love used by Jesus the first 2 times was a form of the divine, noble love about which he had informed them, agape. The word for love as used by Simon all 3 times was phileo. That was a common human love of friendship and affection that probably included all of these. But it was nothing uncommon and exceptional. With the 3rd question, Jesus used Simon's word, phileo. "Simon, do you even have affection for me?" Significantly, Simon never used the Lord's word, agape. Do you remember an earlier instance in John 13, when Jesus had commanded the disciples to love as he loved them? He used agape. Remember, at that time, Peter ignored the command and went straight to one of his own personality-driven actions. He ignored divine love there, and he ignored it again here. The lesson in John 13, and again here in John 21, was that gospel living began from divine life and divine love, agape. Peter had not captured the lesson there, and he missed it again here. In both cases, he avoided any reference to the divine love about which Jesus spoke. He seemed to be avoiding the declaration of a superior, noble, agape love for the Lord. For life-in-life gospel living, Peter would need to begin from divine love, agape, not from human love, like phileo. The changed way of living was essential to the task Jesus gave to Simon 3 different times. He said, "Feed my lambs, take care of my sheep, and feed my sheep." With these 3 statements, Jesus recognized the leadership potential of Simon, a potential that is common to action-oriented people. But that leadership potential had to be applied in a completely different way. Herding sheep would require a lot more action than fishing ever did. And the effort would require more than Simon's action-driven personality could provide. It needed divine life. Nothing else would feed and care for the sheep. The same required changes relate to the following words of Jesus. Let me read verses 18 and 19. Jesus, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." This action-driven man would one day come to the end of all action. Then what? He would be in a passive recipient situation in which others did what they wanted to do with him. What then? Would small life needs once again become dominant in Peter's life? How would he feel about the loss of his freedom to do things his way? What would he become when he could no longer be the take-charge person his personality demanded? How would divine life be present? The next words of Jesus to Simon were significant. "Follow me." These were the very words Jesus had said to Simon when he first called him to be a disciple, as we see in Mark chapter 1. The first invitation was for Simon to be with the divine life-in-life man. The second invitation was for Simon to be a life-in-life man. Hear the difference? Here the challenge was the lesson this chapter is about. To follow Jesus is to have the divine life that Jesus had. It is to be a life-in-life person like him. Here, Simon had the opportunity to become Peter once again. His failures had been forgiven. His past was put behind him. His future before him. And Jesus moved from Peter's rehabilitation, though, to his empowerment. So how did Peter respond?
Well, when things got too personal and close to his heart, Simon had a way of changing the subject. He had done that in John 13. He did it again right here. He turned and saw John was nearby and asked, "Lord, what about him?" The Lord's answer reinforced the gospel living he expected of all the disciples. John's gospel living would be for John to work out. Peter did not have to concern himself with that. Jesus ended by saying, "Follow me," or "Keep on following me. I am concerned about your gospel living." You see, the form of service was not nearly as important as the nature of the servant. Peter would be a shepherd, John a prophet, Peter a preacher, John a writer. Peter would get things going, John would keep them going, but both would have divine life or living.
Let's look at verses 23 to 25. Let me read verse 25. It says, "Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written." This verse gives us a final insight into John's recognition of his task. A prophet, a writer, and a steady-on person. The verse is just a humble addition by the writer. It was all part of his gospel living. He looked at this small book called the Gospel of John he had just written, and he humbly realized that it was only one small book. Whereas the gospel living that Jesus had practiced and demonstrated would fill more books than the whole world could contain. Too many Christians separate gospel believing from gospel living. They believe the incarnation of Jesus, but don't know how to live out that incarnate life. Incarnation, as an abstract, rational concept, doesn't need to be translated into daily life. When we see incarnation as life in life, however, and see that as the gospel itself, then our daily lives are touched by the concrete and the relational. Gospel believing becomes gospel living. Seeing the gospel as God's eternal desire that his life would dwell in human life affects us in concrete relational ways. It affects all of life, anywhere and anytime. What Jesus was, we become. Life in life people. So one question alone is all that is needed as we conclude these 41 messages from the Gospel of John. Are you believing and living the gospel? The Gospel of John was designed to help you see all the grand and wonderful possibilities.